Today, I can confirm that North Korean troops have been sent to Russia and that North Korean military units have been deployed to the Kursk region.
On the morning of October 28th, a delegation from the Republic of Korea briefs NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the North Atlantic Council, and NATO's Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, on North Korea's growing involvement in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine.
The deepening military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is a threat to both the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security. It undermines peace on the Korean peninsula and fuels the Russian war against Ukraine.
By design, NATO is a Euro-Atlantic organization. Yet over the past several years, especially since releasing its new strategic concept in 2022, NATO has underlined the need for stronger and deeper cooperation between the alliance and its Indo-Pacific partners. NATO might be a regional organization, but the security challenges it faces are global in nature.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine has really, in the eyes of many in both regions, sort of solidified the idea that the two regions are connected and that what happens in one region is important to another region.
So I think it's structurally quite hard for it to adapt to a world in which there is basically more than one superpower threat now. There was only one in the time that it was designed.
The key issue for us for the time being is China's deepening strategic partnership with Russia and the support that China is providing to Russia's defense industry.
And having NATO there as another check and balance against rogue states and hostile powers, to include the North Koreans obviously, is significant. Giving confidence to Asian partners that they can be part of security frameworks by using NATO as an example is another way, I think, of being able to collectively respond to the changing security environment.
In this episode, we explore the history and evolution of NATO's relationships with its Indo-Pacific partners, the alliance's role in the growing US-China rivalry, and we look ahead to a new era of NATO engagement outside of the Atlantic Ocean in a time of increasingly interconnected global conflicts. In this series, we are going on a deep dive into why NATO, 75 years in, remains an integral security guarantor for the United States, for Europe, and for those still waiting for membership. Throughout this series, we'll be hearing from people who have dedicated their careers to serving, understanding, and educating about NATO's mission, its work, and its role in preserving transatlantic security. I'm Natalia Kapitnik, Director of Communications at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
I'm Rick Landgraf, Senior Fellow in the Institute's Eurasia program, and this is The Ties That Bind.
NATO at 75 and beyond. Thanks for joining us.
My first guest is Peter Olive. Pete is a former senior officer in the United Kingdom Royal Navy with extensive policy and operational experience in both the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic. Pete is now a senior adjunct fellow at the Honolulu-based think tank Pacific Forum, where his work focuses on the link between Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security. Pete is also a senior advisor at the London-based strategic intelligence firm Herminius. Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me to this show.
My second guest is Dr. John Hemmings. John is a senior associate director for the Pacific Forum. He is an expert on alliances in the region and has lectured and designed research programs that connect Euro-Atlantic security with the Indo-Pacific. In 2023, his research on Hawaii's exclusion from the NATO defense obligations was picked up by a number of prominent media sources, including Newsweek and CNN. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
John, I'd like to start with you today. So NATO is an alliance and an international organization that comprises 32 member states across North America and Europe. It has core responsibilities which include crisis management, collective security, and above all, territorial defense of NATO territory in North America and Europe. So why then should NATO care about the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, thank you, Rick. It's a great question, and I think it's probably the fundamental question for today's discussion. What are the interests for the Indo-Pacific region, which seems to many Europeans so far away from the sort of core area of responsibility for the alliance? I'd start with, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has really, in the eyes of many in both regions, sort of solidified the idea that the two regions are connected and that what happens in one region is important to another region. Secondly, the United States, a core preeminent member of NATO, of the NATO alliance, has deep equities in the security and maintaining security and peace in the region. And if that country goes to war, that has a knock-on effect with the other NATO members. So whether or not they abstain from that conflict, they cannot help but be affected by it. And then third, more getting to the core national interest of European member states and even North American member states like Canada, the sort of source of technology goods coming out of the Indo-Pacific region are so significant. Semiconductor global supply chain from Korea and Taiwan, for example, is a massive part of that. European trade going through the South China Sea is some 40%, according to the Center for International Security Studies, a Washington think tank. And so I think it wouldn't seem apparent that there are clear equities for NATO in the Indo-Pacific. And it's not to say that NATO needs to be in the Indo-Pacific, but the question, if we just take a step back and say, what are the interests and why should NATO care? I think that laying out those three is pretty significant.
Yeah, Pete, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. And I think I'd say the dial is definitely moved for NATO. So if you look at the sort of 2022 declaration of the People's Republic of China as a strategic challenge, I mean, that would have been unthinkable the year before. So clearly the member states of NATO are noting the deteriorating situation in the Indo-Pacific and are concerned about it. And as John sort of indicates, they're worried as well that it's going to draw US attention away. That being said, though, I'm not sure the speed and direction of travel is necessarily keeping up with things. So while NATO has done things like increase its cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners on things that are going to directly affect NATO territory, so things like cyber or hypersonic missiles, I don't know if it's yet been able to fully pick up on some of the implications of what would happen if a crisis were to break in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll give you three examples just to sort of try and add a bit of granularity there. South China Seas, I mean, we're just a mistake or a misjudgment away from a crisis there now. If you look at the number of competing, grey-hulled, grey-painted military assets that are now sort of in that region, and that's not just going to affect the sort of the bordering states of the South China Seas. That's going to bring in China, the US, potentially even Russia, all of which is going to have security implications over in the Euro-Atlantic zone, and almost certainly going to have an economic implication, as if trade takes a hit, which it almost certainly will. If you look at the Korean Peninsula, it's been out in the news recently, but the situation is deteriorating there. I think it's been described as the worst situation since the end of the war in '53. If it were to go badly wrong there, while of course the expectation is it would be the US and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, who are at the front of any kind of response to North Korean aggression. If that were to turn into something major, you could see the situation where the dormant UN command gets reactivated. All those armistice sending states from 1953 receive requests to provide support, and a lot of them are also NATO countries. And then, of course, there's the biggie, if you like, Taiwan, which the situation is definitely not heading in the right direction. So you've got the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, increasing its size and capability massively. 100 new advanced strike fighters just in last year alone. They added to their their available capabilities, and the same across maritime and rocket forces and other things. And that's coinciding with a period where other parts of President Xi's Chinese dream, the sort of economic, societal development of China, are looking a bit faltering, a little bit, like not heading in the right direction. If that were to turn into some kind of threat to the party's authority, to the Communist Party's authority, to Xi's authority, you could well imagine situations where some kind of external aggression might be the way they go to sort of get around that issue. And that coincides again with increasing sort of strength, the anaconda sort of squeeze it's been described of Taiwan, in an attempt to sort of coerce the islanders into some kind of dialogue around reunification, and it hasn't worked. The Democratic People's Party, which has been ruled for the last 2 terms, was again re-elected and are clear in their intentions. Finally, you've got a situation where China had been well ahead on its military capability. It got a really good sort of running start ahead of everybody else. You're now seeing the US and its partners starting to catch up, and that could create a sort of military dynamic in the minds of China's leaders, whereby if we don't do it now, we're not going to be able to. So I think that all adds up to some of these crises, and maybe are not so far off as particularly NATO's European members might care to believe, and the consequences of them could be huge, to the regional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, certainly to drawing away US attention to that region, and certainly economic. I think Bloomberg, it was, that estimated a Taiwan crisis would cost the global economy something like 10 trillion US dollars. That's 10% of the global GDP. It's probably likely to be a bigger hit than that. And you've also see the autocracies of Eurasia, so Russia, North Korea, China, as well, of course, as Iran, increasingly operating in coordination, if not in exactly alliances or specific alliance of the four of them. Whereas Europe, in particular, is still tending to treat the Indo-Pacific as a place that is a long way away. They're not sort of coordinating that way. So there's a lot of drivers there that I think, yes, it's been noted by NATO, but not with maybe the urgency that's needed.
For more context on NATO's current role in the Indo-Pacific and how we got here, Rick spoke with Gwendoline, the head for global partnerships in the Political Affairs and Security Division at NATO headquarters, where she oversees NATO's policy with China and NATO's Indo-Pacific partners.
From your perspective, what is NATO's current role in the Indo-Pacific region?
I think it's important to start by underlining that NATO is and will remain a regional organization, which is an alliance focused on protecting the members in the Euro-Atlantic area. This is what we are meant to do by treaty, by the Washington Treaty, which was signed in 1949. So there are clearly treaty limitations. That's one thing. Then, after the end of the Cold War, as I mentioned earlier, we have developed a network of partnerships, and we have now about 35 partners. And among those partners, we have 4 in the Indo-Pacific region. And the notion of building security through establishing partnership with other countries is really at the core of NATO now. It's really how NATO goes about its business. And it is something that has been recognized after the Cold War through the adoption of one of NATO's core tasks, which we call cooperative security. So during the Cold War, it was all about collective defense. But after the Cold War, we added more core tasks, and one of them is cooperative security, and this is where our partnership network fits into. Now, in terms of the Indo-Pacific, more specifically, this is a relatively new notion to NATO, in fact. But this is something that has now sort of been established under NATO's agenda. The former Secretary General, Stoltenberg, who's just stepped down, used to say that what happens in the Indo-Pacific matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for the Indo-Pacific. But this notion of a link between the two regions has been actually, for the first time, mentioned only 2 years ago, when we published our new strategic concept in 2022. So this is a very, very recent notion here at NATO. I think we recognize that security is global. We are regional. That's our mandate, to protect European and allied territories. But we need to have a global outlook. We need to be well connected. Challenges are global, they know no borders. And we need to better understand challenges coming from outside the Euro-Atlantic zone. And we have developed over the years a strong, very strong partnership with 4 partners that we have in the Indo-Pacific, and with which we are seeking to expand our interaction at all levels. We are seeking to increase cooperation where we have common interests, where we have shared security challenges. We want to be able to talk about it. We want to be able to assess those challenges together and potentially work together on these, on how to address those challenges. But it is not about NATO moving into the Indo-Pacific. This is not about NATO moving military assets into the Indo-Pacific. This is not about NATO becoming a security provider in the Indo-Pacific.
Right, and as you mentioned, the 4 countries in the Indo-Pacific region that NATO has former partnerships with, these are New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. These 4 countries, does NATO meet with them on a 1 versus 32 basis, or is it as a group of 4? How is that structured?
So we have long-standing partnerships with the 4 of them, and these have started as purely bilateral partnership. Like I said, this notion of the Indo-Pacific region, or the IP4, as we often say in shorthand, is relatively recent for NATO. So we started these partnerships, for some of them back in the 90s, and they have developed at different pace. For example, with Australia, Japan, and Korea, we have developed a very strong operational interaction when NATO had an operation in Afghanistan. After the withdrawal of the ISAF mission, not the withdrawal from Afghanistan altogether, we started to develop political dialogue, in particular with Japan, in particular with Australia. So these relationships have their own pace. They're different. These are 2 very different partners. The relationships that we develop there are what we call interest-driven. So it's based on a common interest between NATO and, let's say, Japan, for example. And on that basis, we develop a cooperation program with them. Now, the notion of the Indo-Pacific and the notion of a sort of a grouping appeared around 2017 only. And the first discussion we had at the time were linked to the DPRK. Then this notion, or this sort of grouping, started to develop. And we started to, in addition to meeting these partners on a bilateral basis, we started to meet them as a group. There's been an acceleration there since 2017, and in particular after COVID, basically, when these meetings not only were organized at the level of the North Atlantic Council and the level of permanent representatives, but was also elevated to ministerial meetings or to summit meetings with our leaders. And there were the 4 leaders of Japan, Korea, and New Zealand were with us last July in Washington when NATO celebrated the 75th anniversary. So these are 2 important tracks. There's the bilateral track, and then there's the IP4 track that we will continue to develop as we move forward. But I don't want to say that one track is more important than the other.
One of the IP4 partners with a long-standing relationship with NATO is Australia. To learn more about how Australia's partnership with NATO and NATO allies was established and has developed over the years, Rick spoke with Ian Langford, a retired military officer for the Australian Defence Force who served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Jordan, and the Solomon Islands, to name just a few, and is now an academic at the University of New South Wales.
NATO's partnership with Australia throughout the early part of its history was more or less based on Australia's military alliance with the United States, commonly known as ANZUS, or the Australian-New Zealand-US military alliance. That was pretty much the forum in which Australia more or less indirectly contributed to NATO's greater role in that Cold War context. So we saw through ANZUS the establishment of what eventually became the rules-based global order in the post sort of Bretton Woods 20th century. But that relationship really changed in the period post the attacks of September 11, 2001, which resulted in Australia's contribution into commitments in Afghanistan under the International Security Assistance Force regime, which was clearly led by NATO, resulting in formal dialogue and cooperation. The first being in June 2012, NATO and Australia became partners for peace, essentially. And that cooperation then evolved into what's currently known as the Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program. Australia supports NATO in many areas, ISAF in Afghanistan being the most obvious in a historical context. But since its commitment to Afghanistan, that security framework has now evolved as the Indo-Pacific sort of becomes more acknowledged by many that its role in global power politics and the future of the world, frankly, necessitates a security framework that extends beyond just those that we formed in the Afghanistan years and in the outer years of the last decade. So what we see now is a really enhanced focus on how NATO and Australia relations can uphold what we again commonly refer to as rules-based international order. And there are areas of interest and priority with cyber defence, hybrid non-traditional threats, even just virtues and the value of bringing a values-based system to security frameworks to include women, peace and security, as well as the impact of technology on the security sector, what it might mean for military and non-military threats. So Australia's relationship with NATO really has now diversified beyond merely security commitments into a much more complex and capable framework, which really does reflect the security environment that we're now all operating in. And I'll just highlight a really good and apparent example of that has been the nexus between security in North Asia and security in Europe, manifesting in the war in Ukraine, where we now see reports of North Korean soldiers joining Russian forces in that theatre in Europe. And that's a really obvious example of the security interdependencies between the area that is traditional to NATO and the North Atlantic Alliance more broadly, but also now the spreading impacts and influences of a global security system where an event somewhere might mean actions anywhere. And so what that necessitates is for Australia and NATO to really broaden their relationship, to think about the security state that we now live in and the cause and effect requirement for us to be much more broad in our focus and quite fulsome in its application.
Yeah, you mentioned reports this week and going back a little bit further about North Korean troop involvement in the Ukraine war. That really helps us understand how these two theaters are so interconnected, the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater, and the risk that this war in Ukraine may expand even further. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Australia and its role in supporting NATO-led operations and missions. Of course, Australia was one of the largest non-NATO troop contributors to the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF mission Afghanistan. Can you tell a little bit about what Australia contributed to that mission and what unique kind of capabilities Australia brings to the table with supporting NATO operations and missions?
Absolutely. Many of your listeners would be aware that in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, Australia invoked its Article 4 provisions of ANZUS, which is commonly sort of understood as an attack on one is an attack on all. And so in the early phases of the Afghanistan response led by the United States, really commencing on around 17-18 October 2001, Australia was a troop contributor to that effort, which saw the collapse of the Taliban. And then as that mission evolved over the coming years into what would eventually become ISAF, led by NATO, Australia's commitment to ongoing security its obligations to bring security to Afghanistan, but think about the global war on terror more broadly, saw it as a partner for peace really extend its commitment to the levels that your question indicated. So by sort of the mid to late 2006, 7, 8, we had what constituted essentially a brigade in the Uruzgan province area, as well as contributions to various training schools, to ISAF headquarters itself, to many of the military supply lines of communication in and out of that country. And so our contribution was really focused on security effects in and around Uruzgan, but also some of the niche capabilities that we're able to provide in command and control, in logistics, in training. That meant that we were committed to that theatre in all sorts of ways. And of course, that commitment ran all the way through to the end of ISAF-led sort of combat operations in around the 2013-2014 period, and then obviously we were there during the catastrophe of the eventual withdrawal and really the end of that campaign. So Afghanistan became, I think, really a metaphor for the interdependencies between NATO and Australia, and again the security impacts and effects of issues such as Afghanistan, but also around that period we had obviously the counter-piracy operations in and around the Red Sea. We worked together on things like countering threat finance and that lethal aid network, if you like, of money and illegal gain to facilitate security threats, both traditional and non-traditional. And so now we have what was an Afghanistan commitment really now maturing into a better understanding of global security issues, a real focus on enhancing our interoperability between NATO and Australia, and again, thinking about what does resilience mean, for example, in the modern world when it comes to the security frameworks that need to bring security and meet our security obligations, if you like, both in the North Atlantic but also in the Asia-Pacific.
Yeah, you mentioned the niche capabilities, and I recall I was in Afghanistan 2013, 2014, supporting counter threat finance and counter narcotics missions, specifically with the Special Operations Task Forces over there, ISAF SOF. And I recall that the Australians brought quite a large contingent to that, and really supported that effort seamlessly with U.S. SOF elements and across ISAF. And I saw firsthand just the level of professionalism and teamwork that Australia provided to that mission. So definitely a great partner in that operation.
Yeah, I mean, again, it was a really important moment, I think, in also the maturing and the evolution of the Australian Defence Force. So, we have 4 structured determinants, which are a fancy way of describing what our priorities are around how we design and resource forces, how we give them their sort of mandate as well. And in the context of Afghanistan, our earlier commitments with the Americans were under their command and control framework, which a lot of which involved special forces. And as you indicate, I was actually on the staff of NSOC Alpha, the NATO Special Operations Component Command, which established itself in Kabul in about, if my memory serves me well, the back end of 2007, moving into 2008, which became ISAF SOF, and eventually became SGDIF Alpha towards the back end. So
a lot of acronyms there.
there is. So again, ISAF SOF being obvious in the context, the NSOC Alpha was the NATO Special Operations Component Command,
Sure.
Which was establishing itself as a functional headquarters in Afghanistan in 2008. And then by the time we got to 2012, 2013, it had evolved once more into the Special Operations Joint Task Force Afghanistan, so SGDIF Alpha, which was ISAF SOF plus essentially another command and control framework to bring into line some of the command and control changes across theatre more broadly. So that framework of which Australia was part of really since late 2001, which sort of bound ISAF SOF in this instance and Australian special operations contributions together, really demonstrated the potential of the relationship. And I think is a pretty good framework to think about how we might do things in the future.
As far as NATO organization, what is NATO currently doing in the region? There's so much focus, obviously, on the European theater and on supporting Ukraine since Russia's renewed invasion in 2022. But what is NATO doing in the Indo-Pacific region specifically, Pete?
So I think the perception is it's doing more, but the reality is it's individual NATO nations who are doing more, not under a NATO flag. So you've seen increasing numbers of transits through the South China Seas, through the Taiwan Strait. Countries like Germany doing transits like that, which is unprecedented again in many ways. Hasn't been done for a while, at least. You're seeing more cooperation on sort of exercise and other things. You're seeing some NATO's European members, alongside, of course, the US, increasing their permanent presence in the region, looking to coordinate their carrier strike group deployments. So there is more going on, and then there's a sort of capacity, military capacity partnerships that are being developed by some of those nations. So things like AUKUS, and the cooperation between Italy, the UK, and Japan on a sort of sixth generation fighter. But none of those things have been done as NATO as a collective. Although those things often get confused, not least because the likes of Russia and China want to represent that as NATO in the region, whereas it's not. It's NATO nations doing things individually, not NATO as a whole. If you were to look at what NATO is doing collectively, it's a bit more muted and a bit one way. So some of those capability partnerships that I mentioned earlier, but also inviting the leaders of their Indo-Pacific partners, the so-called IP4, to their annual summit since 2022. But then when it came to even things like a proposed liaison office for NATO in Japan, that was vetoed. And a lot of the dialogue that's been going on, it's really been about how those partners in the Indo-Pacific can help out over the Ukraine situation, rather than about how NATO might help deter further aggression in the Indo-Pacific.
So John, turning back to you, who are NATO's key partners in the region, and what is the history and the purpose of these partnerships as they stand right now?
Well, it's a great question, Rick. I mean, you have what we call the Indo-Pacific Four: Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. This arrangement is a formal arrangement by which those countries have sort of official relations with NATO. They're not observers, they're not members, but they do have certain equities. They also have standardization agreements by which they seek to, drive equipment standards closer and more in alignment. Some, like Japan, have been much more active than others. I think the Japanese seem to be much further behind the other four in say the late 1990s, early 2000s, and so began to really push hard, having the more significant staff dedicated to NATO affairs in their Brussels embassy, getting more of their students to the NATO Defense College. So just trying to build up, the sinews, the people-to-people contacts. And then we've seen that in the Japanese defense think tank field, much more scholars and Japanese military academics focused on NATO and NATO affairs. So, as Pete said earlier, at the bilateral level, NATO in the Indo-Pacific is much more active. And I think it's in terms of the IP4, as they're called, that the development of that has been gradual, very formulaic. I think there's been in some areas, for example, defense industrial cooperation, areas of synergy, and we've seen those countries, for example, pulled in to non-NATO things, but that are related to Europe. I'll give you a classic example of this: the Prague Protocol, which was a 5G conference that the Czech Republic hosted in, I believe it was 2019, alongside the United States. And you could see by the member states, they were mostly NATO members and the IP4. So that's not an official IP4 thing, but the IP4 status has sort of afforded those four countries more involvement in some of those issues that are sort of cross-sector. They're not theater specific, And then, of course, the obvious one with war in Afghanistan, where NATO and ISAF had a very strong remit from the international community to deploy troops and build up provincial reconstruction teams and so on. Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand all played very, very strong roles in that. Japan, I believe, was the second largest contributor of funding to the war in Afghanistan after the United States. South Korea had a provincial reconstruction team in Parwan near the embassy. And so they all worked under ISAF pretty smoothly, worked closely with the US. So in a sense, all of them having alliance relations with the United States is a sort of ease of passage for the four. They all have that sort of inclination to standardize in the same direction that the US equipment standards are set. But NATO also reinforces that. So yeah, just within in the perspective of defense industry and defense production and innovation, I think we've seen a lot of stuff happening that wouldn't necessarily be termed NATO official, but is helped by that IP4 construct.
These partnerships grew out of concern with North Korea and yet also other concerns in the region and the increasing geopolitical competition between the United States and China. How does NATO factor into increasing competition in the region?
I mean, again, NATO is not the US, so NATO is just a tool that is used by allies. And in the case of increasing geopolitical competition between the US and China, to us, what is important, what has been important over the last 5 years, is to understand how China's policies, China's action can affect Euro-Atlantic security. And you always have to remember this is our task, basically. It is Euro-Atlantic security. This is what NATO is meant to do. So what we have done over the last 5 years, that we have started to look more deeply how China can impact our own security here. So we can use NATO as a platform, as a transatlantic platform, to discuss, to understand China, to discuss it together, to build a common picture, which is very important, to have a common assessment, a common picture, and on that basis see whether there are areas where NATO should respond. We are just one actor. There are many different actors in this, of course, and for example, also the European Union.
In what ways are China's actions affecting security in the Euro-Atlantic space? Can you point to some specific examples here?
I think, we are looking at, in particular now, and I think that is the key issue for us for the time being, is China's deepening strategic partnership with Russia and the support that China is providing to Russia's defense industry. And we consider that it's a decisive enabler, actually, of Russia's ability to sustain its war against Ukraine. So that is a key issue for us, is how China is supporting Russia in the political sphere, with material support, with economic support, with dual use goods support that can also be used in the context of Ukraine. So that is one key area of concern. We are also watching how China is increasingly being assertive and using economic coercions to create strategic dependencies. We're looking at how it very aggressively asserts its illegitimate maritime claims, how it is interfering with democratic and academic institutions. And importantly for NATO, we are looking at how China is rapidly developing military capacity and capabilities without transparency. And that includes its nuclear arsenal. And there, I want to emphasize that we are not concerned about the fact that China is modernizing. I think we all do that, but we are concerned in particular by the lack of transparency. There are many other areas that I could mention For example, China's attempt to shape new technological norms and standards, attempts to dominate new technologies such as AI and quantum. There are a number of issues, and what is important now at NATO is that while 5 years ago we had no discussion of China at NATO, now today consideration of China are well embedded into NATO's work.
Turning now to the Indo-Pacific theater and Australia's role in the increasing U.S.-China competition. Previously, in this episode, we've talked with some guests about what NATO is doing in the Indo-Pacific and specifically what allies are doing in the Indo-Pacific. There's been reports this year of an Italian, carrier strike group moving into the Indo-Pacific, doing exercises there. There's news about the British doing something similar. I saw just this past week that a New Zealand vessel went through the Taiwan Strait. So there's NATO partners, seems like, doing more things in the Indo-Pacific as a way to check China's ambitions and aggression in the area. So what is, obviously, geography matters here. Australia is in the Indo-Pacific. It's an Indo-Pacific nation. What is Australia's perspective on this U.S.-China competition we see in that region? And what has Australia been doing to help counter Chinese aggression there?
Well, I think it's sort of in answering that question, it's important to give context to your listeners in terms of how diplomacy and multilateralism works or doesn't work in the Asia Pacific. So many would be familiar with that historical effort to build a NATO-like alliance in this part of the world throughout the Cold War. So the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO, was one example of that, which resulted really in it not being very effective at all. And out of that, through ASEAN and through some of the other alliance and diplomacy frameworks, this convention around non-interference has been largely agreed to in the context of how countries relate to one another and manage their security affairs in the period really since the end of the Cold War. So non-interference means that countries more or less mind their business and don't get involved too much. Now, again, if you read the NATO Charter, if you understand the importance of collective security, certainly it's difficult to reconcile that in the world in which we now live. And so what is clear as an opportunity for NATO in this part of the world is some leadership and I think some frameworks in terms of how security dialogues and structures might move going forward. Some people wouldn't be aware that, Japan's closest neighbor in terms of distance is actually Russia. And so, Japan is also, a NATO partner in the Indo-Pacific region, as indeed is Korea and New Zealand and obviously Australia in the frameworks that we've previously described. So to see a NATO dimension to the Indo-Pacific is very welcome. The opportunity for NATO members to be able to contribute to collective security through increase in presence, through maritime patrolling, through things like exercise Talisman Sabre, which is run in Australia every 2 years. Typically, that exercise was a bilateral capability demonstrated, if you like, focused on interoperability between Australia and the United States. But that's now also drawing in other members. Japan is one such, but also NATO members. But having NATO there as another check and balance against rogue states and hostile powers, to include the North Koreans, obviously, is significant. Giving confidence to Asian partners that they can be part of security frameworks by using NATO as an example is another way, I think, of being able to collectively respond to the changing security environments.
Let's talk a little bit about if there's any tensions within the alliance over committing more resources to the Indo-Pacific and doing more in the region. John?
Yeah, I think this conversation is very, very timely, Rick, and I thank you for doing it because in many ways, while I think there's been broad acceptance in both the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific about the connectivity between the two regions, I think there's real hesitation in the Euro-Atlantic to commit Indo-Pacific resources and defense platforms and deterrence obligations to partners out in the Indo-Pacific. And I think some of the arguments are pretty strong. There is, after all, a U.S. alliance network in the Indo-Pacific, the San Francisco system, which connects U.S. to Korea and Japan and the Philippines, Thailand. A soft arrangement with Singapore, not a full alliance, but certainly a very robust defense arrangement. And of course, ANZUS mentioned by Pete. So, why should NATO bolster those? I think would be, an argument, and thus weaken the amount of resources that can be deployed in support of, the war against Russian aggression in Ukraine, which I think all NATO members have, especially in Europe, where the core of the alliance's focus is, where they have very, very strong interests in seeing Russia thwarted in its attempt to take over Ukraine.
So, John, shifting gears here a little, in what ways has the increased attention on the Indo-Pacific by some of the NATO allies on a bilateral basis or a minilateral basis, to what extent is this a hedging strategy to persuade the Americans to stay engaged in NATO? I guess, in other words, are the Europeans only paying attention to China because the Americans want them to?
I think so. I think the initial drive. I'll start with the following statement. The 2022 security concept talks about the rules-based order. I lecture on the rules-based order, at different institutions, and I often think we talk about it without knowing what it is and why we're fighting for it. It's not U.S. primacy. It's not U.S. insistence on Taiwan being independent from China in order to contain China. We hear a lot of that messaging, which I think is sort of wispy and smoky. I think what it's fundamentally about is, what type of order do you want to live in? One in which there was a broad set of rules that, yes, are not perfectly adhered to, but at least those rules are over everyone, including the largest power, the United States. Or do we want a system in which, there is one superpower, the Middle Kingdom, China, which fundamentally, and so persuading European states to care about the Indo-Pacific is not just about talking about trade in the South China Sea or what Japan and Korea would love for them to do or what the United States would love for them to do. I think it's really important for us to try to understand those strategic possibilities at that top level. And I think what we're seeing in the European context, and Pete, again, you can correct me on this, we're seeing a lot more Europeans coming to the Indo-Pacific at the military side, the uniform side. And I'm hearing them speak, and I'm feeling like, they get it. They get that there's a sort of European story out here. Europe, after all, had a war 70 years ago, which was exactly about authoritarian, might is right, and about territorial aggrandizement. So the Europeans know this story, and I hear them pulling that out in their discussions over here in the United States with U.S. officials. And that's very heartening to see that. I don't think all of us really understand how connected the two regions are and how much Russia and China are going to treat them as connected as they tentatively but increasingly confidently move towards changing that balance of power in a way that reflects their authoritarian preferences.
So NATO's role in the increasing U.S.-China competition, has NATO carved a role out for itself in this situation?
I'd say now, at the moment, it's largely in the public diplomacy space. So some of the things we already talked about. So that really momentous decision to identify China as a strategic challenge in 2022. You'll see statements about concerns about regional developments in the Indo-Pacific, a much more pointed statement in the last communique after the last summit about the role that China and North Korea are playing in supporting Russia. And some of those capability developments as well, which are sort of longer term, certainly longer than the 2027 deadline that has been given to the PLA to be ready for an attack on Taiwan, for example. But when it comes more to what could NATO do to help deter deterrence and defense within the Indo-Pacific, even if only from afar, I think there's more that could be done. But that's going to need some kind of change to the zeitgeist, I think, to get the sort of get over that sort of current disconnect that seems to be going on, where it's still considered as a distant problem.
We're speaking now in mid-November, about a week after the U.S. elections. Donald Trump has been reelected as president, will be inaugurated later in January of next year. What is the initial reaction in the halls of NATO headquarters about Donald Trump coming back to the White House?
Well, for us, the cornerstone remains the Washington Treaty. We expect that the U.S. will continue to work on that basis. Of course, we know from the first Trump administration some of the topics that will be at the forefront of their agenda. Obviously, there's defense spending or fair burden sharing, which is a point that President Trump at the time made very forcefully. I think he's going to find an organization that is very different from the one he founded in 2016. At the time, 3 allies only were meeting 2% GDP in terms of defense spending, and we now have 23 allies meeting that 2%. So I think, of course, there's more that needs to be done, and more will be done, but we are moving in the right direction. And obviously, Ukraine has also pushed us in that direction. The other item, indeed, that we think would be on the agenda of the new U.S. administration is China. Also on this one, I think we are in a good shape. When President Trump left the White House in 2020, we were just starting our work on China. It's now well embedded into NATO's agenda. This is a standing item here at NATO. So he will also find a very different organization when it comes to China.
Certainly, from China to Ukraine to defense investment, there are a lot of items on NATO's agenda as we move from 2024 into 2025.
This has been The Ties That Bind, NATO at 75 and Beyond, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Our guests were all incredibly generous with their time, so we do encourage you to hear all of their insights in the complete interviews and transcripts available in the link in the description of this episode. And join us in a few weeks as we look ahead. Where does NATO go from here? What are NATO's priorities and challenges over the next decade? Can the alliance survive another Donald Trump presidency? And what happens if the United States withdraws from the alliance? In the meantime, we want to hear from you. If you have any questions for our host or guests, please do leave us a comment through Substack, tiesthatbind.substack.com, at the handle FPRI on X, or email us at comms@fpri.org. For more podcasts, analysis, and to learn about upcoming events, please visit us at fpri.org.